Standard claim is that philosophy begins with Thales. The father of philosophy was a Greek who flourished around 600 BCE, and after him philosophy flourished among the Greeks more broadly. But why the Greeks, and why at that time? That's about 2,600 years ago, but Homo sapiens has been around for 200,000 years or more. A mere 2 millennia ago, give or take a few, centuries is about 1% of the time that big-brained human beings have existed. And think of all of the countless cultures across uncounted millennia. Why did philosophy come into being in a cluster of cities and villages around the Aegean Sea? And why Thales in particular, a man from Miletus, right on the coast of Asia Minor? When I teach the significance of Thales to my students, it's often a rather hard sell for. Let me give you the founding texts in philosophy. These are ascribed to Thales by Aristotle some centuries later. And we only have 2 very short excerpts from Thales. Here's the first one. The first principle and basic nature of all things is water. And here's the second. All things are full of gods. Now you can imagine how impressed my students are when they read those for the first time or I read them in class, so let me repeat them so you can absorb their significance. The first principle and basic nature of all things is water, and all things are full of gods. Now, clearly some interpretation is necessary. Why do historians of philosophy get worked up over these lines? Now, that's a long story. Try to keep it as short as possible in our podcasts. But to see their significance, I want to set a context for them by going back to the worldview of Homer, the great Homer, actually the awesomely great Homer. So if you have some time, brush up on the Iliad. And I want to use that as our pre-philosophy-worldview contrast object. And or if you're a movie person, I do recommend the 2004 movie Troy, which has many virtues, among them capturing the mythic yet realistic feel of the times. The movie features Brad Pitt as Achilles, Eric Bana as Hector, and Orlando Bloom as Paris, and there are other names you will recognize. So let's go back to Homer, and the episode I want to focus on in the Iliad is the death of Hector. Now, Homer himself is thought to have lived in the 800s or 700s BCE, probably a century or two before Thales, who was born in 624 BCE. Homer's Iliad and his Odyssey are magnificent expressions of archaic Greek culture, and they really are of incalculable importance to the Greek way of thinking about human life and its place in the universe. So I want to focus on just one major event in the Iliad to illustrate what I'm taking to be a pre-philosophical yet very sophisticated view of reality. And that's the death of Hector. So why did Hector die? So we can imagine his father, Priam, in anguish, asking this question, why did my son Hector die? And Hector's wife doing the same question. And Hector's young son later when he grows up, why did Hector, my father, die? And the answer is, Hector died because Achilles killed him. But then we ask the follow-up question, but why did Achilles kill him? Well, there's a broad context here and there's a narrow context. The broad context is that the Greeks were at war with the Trojans. The more specific context is that Achilles wanted revenge for the death of Patroclus. In each case, we can trace back a causal chain. on the broad context. So then we can ask, well, why were the Greeks and the Trojans fighting? And here there's a network of causes that come to bear. Well, because Paris and Helen fell in love. Menelaus, who was married to Helen, became a cuckold and a vengeful cuckold. He wanted revenge. His brother Agamemnon, perhaps the greatest of the warlords among the Greeks, Agamemnon had a great ambition for power. Achilles was talked into joining the war because he wanted glory, and so on. So what we have in Homer's world, in the major characters, we have the key motivations that drive human action: love, revenge, power, glory. They're played out through these key representative individuals. And that's the broad context. But what about the specific context? So we say Achilles killed Hector because he wanted revenge for the death of Patroclus, but why did Patroclus get killed? And again, we can trace back a causal chain. As Homer tells it, he was a young man. He wanted to prove himself. At that time, Achilles was sulking in his tent for various reasons. Agamemnon had stolen a girl from him, and so on. So we have more causes and more effects, and they're all woven by Hector into this coherent network of explanation. But notice so far that all of this is naturalistic explanation, and it's in terms of human agency. And so what we have from Homer is a very sophisticated and complicated interplay of human desire and motivation and action and reaction. And all of that explains major events like the Trojan War, and then specific events like the death of Hector in particular. But Homer's story and Homer's worldview is more complicated because the gods are also an important part of the causal matrix. So as the great battle between Achilles and Hector is looming, Homer turns our attention to the gods and the goddesses, all of whom are watching with great interest. Zeus sees Achilles chasing Hector, and he's torn. He loves Hector, and he admires Achilles, so whom should he favor in this contest? Zeus eventually finds the tension unbearable, and he calls upon the other gods and goddesses who are present for advice. "Come, you mortals, think this through, decide. Either we pluck the man from death and save his life, or strike him down at last here at Achilles' hands." Now, Athena protests that there's even a decision or a tough choice that needs to be made. Zeus eventually agrees with her that Hector should die, and so he tells her, "Go, do as your own impulse bids you. Hold back no more." So he launched Athena, already poised for action, down the goddess swept from Olympus's craggy peaks. Now, as the story goes, Athena then tricks Hector by impersonating his brother Deiphobus, causing Hector to stop running. That allows Hector to catch up with him and kill him. That's a summary of the plot and a specific network of events and so forth. But let's get philosophical here and say, what kind of metaphysics, what kind of world is Homer portraying for us? And what are the metaphysical lessons of Homer's reality? That is, what principles capture the way the universe works in Homer's portrayal?
We all know what true crime is, but what about untrue crime? The true stories of innocent people whose lives have been ripped apart and who have not been allowed to tell their stories until now. Listen to Untrue Crime on the Possibly Correct Network as Diana Davison sheds light onto cases where reputations have been ruined, careers have been destroyed, and countless lies have been told. Find out what really happens when the finger of blame points to someone who's innocent. Subscribe to the Untrue Crime Podcast by going to www.untruecrimepodcast.com and follow the show on Facebook, Minds.com and Gab for all the latest news and releases. You can check out all of our podcasts by following Possibly Correct on Minds.com.
Several points, right? A first and important point is to say that naturalistic human agency for Homer alone does not cause events on Earth. The gods and the goddesses are active participants. It's their desires, their decisions, their actions. They're very important. Zeus could have decided differently. Athena could have switched her affections. Consequently, Hector's fate and the outcome of the entire Trojan War could have been very different. Human agency isn't the only cause operative. Now, second, and closely related to that first point, in Homer's world, it's the supernatural forces that are the more powerful and important causal forces. If the gods decide against something, it will not happen. And if the gods decide that something will happen, it will. Human agency is a lesser power. Now, a third theme in Homer, and this is kind of omnipresent in all of the stories, is that the gods and goddesses, who are the ultimate, or at least the most powerful forces in the world, that they are often whimsical, and they're divided among themselves. Zeus himself is often driven by his changeable passions. He gets into quarrels with Athena and the others. There is constantly, and consequently, there's no stable or predictable causal order in the natural world because of the nature of the gods. Now, there is some sort of notion of fate operative in Homer. It's not consistent, its role is not clear, at least it's not clear to me. I'm only a philosopher mining Homer's literature to set up a point about philosophy here, so I will leave it to the real experts in the archaic age of Greek literature to sort out the fatalism, determinism, volitionism issues in the Iliad. But the point is, the universe is not apparently deterministic, but run by whimsical, or largely run by whimsical supernatural beings. A fourth point worth mentioning about Homer's world concerns ethics. Right? Humans worship the gods. But why do they worship the gods? Not because they are moral, but because they are powerful. The gods, as portrayed, are very far from morally admirable. They're given to a wide range of vices and foibles. So this raises the question, what is the source and purpose of justice and other morally important realities? Now, it's not that concepts of right and wrong are foreign to the gods, but the gods themselves are not very clear ethically, and they're not consistent either in word or deed in Homer. And of course, human beings, they're not also consistent or clear, ethically speaking. So the place of morality in the universe, Homer's universe here, seems at best tenuous. Amoral power seems to rule both the natural realm and the realm beyond. Now, abstractly put, in the summary here, I think we can pull out 5 kind of implicit metaphysical and ethical theses in Homer's worldview. 1, supernatural causation is part of the explanation for natural events. A second one, supernatural causation is more powerful than natural causation. The supernatural world is personal, populated by persons, gods and goddesses. As a result, and this is the fourth point, supernatural causation is sometimes whimsical and so inconsistent, and so it makes long-range prediction very unreliable. Consequently, and fifth, an ethics point, ethics is matter mostly of power. We revere gods and kings not because they're just, but because they are powerful. Now, with that summary of one episode in Homer and some philosophical extraction, we're ready for the revolution initiated by Thales. This is now late 600s, early 500s BCE. What would happen if we denied some or all of those 5 points that I just sketched out from Homer? What would our account of the world look like? And it's when that happens that philosophy begins, and Thales is the first to mount this revolution. All right, now I'm going to label these 5 Homeric theses, as I'm calling them, H1 through H5, just for a shorthand tag. So H1, supernatural causation is part of the explanation for natural events. H2, supernatural causation is more powerful than natural causation. H3, the supernatural realm is personal. H4, consequently, supernatural causation is sometimes whimsical and so inconsistent, and so makes long-range prediction unreliable. And then H5, consequently, ethics is mostly a matter of power. We revere the kings and gods because of the power they have and what they can do to us, not because they are paragons of virtue. All right, now with that in mind, let's return to Thales and the birth of a new worldview. First quotation again. The first principle and basic nature of all things is water. Let's unpack that and parse it. Note, Thales' first principle is water. Well, if the first principle is water, then it is not the gods. The gods become secondary. And so in that Thales quotation, we have at least an implicit challenge to the second of Homeric's claims about the primacy of the supernatural. The first principle is whatever it is. Also, note in that quotation, the basic nature of all things is water. All things. But water is a natural phenomenon. It's not a supernatural one. So we have here at least an implicit denial of H1, that is to say, the first Homeric claim that the supernatural is even a part of the explanation for why things happen. So what we see in Thales is a strong step taken toward a thoroughgoing naturalism. That's the first, that's the all, but why water? Well, no doubt, we have Thales. We can imagine him observing the weather cycle, right, as we all do. The flowing of rain into streams and eventually out to the sea. The critical importance of water to all living things. Noticing the fact that water can be transformed from liquid to solid and back from liquid to gas and back, and that it does so with a regularity. Now, it's not, I think, that nobody had noticed regularities in nature before Thales, but if water is the first principle of all things, and it is regular, then all of reality is regular. So here we have at least an implicit challenge to Homer's fourth claim about causation being whimsical and ultimately unpredictable. So what we are in Thales, just with this unpacking of that first quotation, is that we are well on our way to thinking of nature as a self-contained, self-governing, and regular physical system of cause and effect.
In his book, Entrepreneurial Living, 15 Stories of Innovation, Risk and Achievement, and 1 Story of Abject Failure, Professor Stephen Hicks has put together a series of interviews with entrepreneurs from 6 different countries and 7 US states to explore the adventure and the hard-headedness of business. In this book, Hicks explores what makes for entrepreneurial success and failure. To what extent does success depend on the key decisions, ideas, persistent action, or character traits? How does one's business life fit into one's overall life? And how does one even define success? Our belief is that we can always learn from the accomplishments and setbacks of others. The life stories from others can be informative, cautionary, and inspirational, as we each strive to more fully realize our own potentials and achieve our own goals. The 16 entrepreneurs featured in this book are widespread geographically as well as in the range of their endeavors, from sports to education, to fashion to technology, to finance to advertising, to architecture to cosmetics, and more. Observation of success and failure is often the best way to avoid pitfalls, learning from the mistakes of others to get on the pathway to success. This book doesn't disappoint, providing engaging and useful insights from the accounts of 16 entrepreneurs whose reflections are both personal to them and timeless in their significance for the rest of us. Pick up your copy of Entrepreneurial Living, 15 Stories of Innovation, Risk and Achievement, and 1 Story of Abject Failure by Stephen Hicks on Amazon.com. And while you're online, please leave a review for the Open College Podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
Now, it's also clear that Thales' statement is based on observations, right, of transformations from liquids to gases to solids and so on. So it's not like he's basing his views on traditional stories that have been handed down through the ages. And he's offering an explanatory hypothesis for those observations. So we have observation integrated with explanation, and that is the hallmark of a philosophical approach, a naturalistic philosophical approach. It's also then important to notice that very quickly, subsequent pre-Socratic thinkers, that is to say, other philosophers and thinkers before we get to Socrates, they would argue with Thales. By contrast, who's ever going to argue with Homer? Homer is Homer. The stories are set. You pass them on, you enjoy them, but you don't question them and challenge them. For example, Anaximenes disagreed with Thales. He held that fire was a better first principle candidate than water was. Heraclitus and the next generation agreed. Anaximander, now he's my favorite pre-Socratic philosopher, he held that having only one basic state of being, whether it was water or fire, that's too reductionistic. And so what he proposed was that water and air and earth and fire were in what he considered to be a cyclical transformation in and out of what he called a boundless state. And other early philosopher-scientists entered into the fray, and clearly we have vigorous argumentation about causation, chemistry, physics, and so on. Notice also that the pre-Socratics are now using reason in a different way. It's not clear that they are fully self-conscious about this new method of thinking. For that, my hypothesis is that we actually need to wait for Pythagoras and then Parmenides just a little bit later. But Thales and the others are no longer thinking in Homeric principles. And the new thinkers actually very quickly, they start to become incredulous and scornful whenever the Homeric and other stories are taken as anything more than kind of fanciful literature. Hecataeus of Miletus, for example, his dates are 550 to 489. He died just 19 years before the birth of Socrates, so another transition figure. He's representative here about the new attitude toward Homer. What I write here is the account of what I considered to be true. For the stories of the Greeks are numerous and, in my opinion, ridiculous. Unquote. A new way of thinking has begun. Philosophy and the sciences have been launched, and then very quickly in the generations after Thales, they flourished quickly all over Greek culture. Now, as for H5, as I think of it, or that fifth Homeric thesis about ethics and the relationship between humans and gods and where we get our moral standards from, the development of a philosophical approach to ethics, that story I think is worthy of another discussion. But where do we get our ethics from? Is there really such a thing as justice? Can it survive in this world of power? Why be courageous and principled? Can, in fact, we rely on the gods for that, as they hardly seem to be paragons of virtue and moral principles? Now, philosophical ethics, by the time we get to the generations of Socrates and then Plato and Aristotle, becomes very mature and very sophisticated very quickly. But that philosophical approach to ethics also involves some innovations of Hesiod and other early pre-Socratic intellectual giants, as well as the collection of charming Greek bedtime stories that parents told their children about humans and the gods. I'll send a link to one that I particularly like called Arachne and Athena. And for more on the birth of philosophical ethics, stay tuned to my Open College podcast for more.
The host of the Open College podcast, Dr. Stephen Hicks, is a renowned philosopher and author. His field of study and insights into postmodernism explain how it has become one of the most powerful intellectual movements of our time, and what that actually means. If you'd like to access more information from Dr. Hicks himself, then check out his website at www.stephenhicks.org. You'll be able to find details on his latest publications, courses, and philosophical information concerning business ethics, education, intellectual history, and religion. To stay up to date with the latest from Stephen Hicks himself, make sure you've subscribed to the Open College Podcast feed and follow at Open College Podcast on all your favourite social networks. And while you're online, please leave the show a review on iTunes and Stitcher.